Well, it was roughly a month ago when James, who I meet with on a regular basis for food and fellowship, those kind of things, asked me if I'd be willing to preach on this Sunday, and I'm always up for that opportunity. This Sunday actually represents 7 years since I stepped out of active pastoral ministry, and so the chance to step back in was appreciated very much. And so I asked him, so what are you preaching on? What is the subject matter, and what is the text? And he said, well, we're in this series on Joseph, and so you have chapter 42. And I thought, okay, well, chapter 42. I wasn't sure I heard him correctly, and so I went home and I pulled up chapter 42, and I looked at it, and I thought, did I hear correctly? And so I had coffee with Pastor Randy. I said, so what are y'all thinking in this whole series you're doing and what today is supposed to be? And so he explained his vision for that, and then had lunch with James. And I said, can you explain to me what your vision and what are the constraints of what I can cover? Is it just chapter 42? He said, it's just chapter 42. And now I've been preaching. I surrendered to preach August the 8th, 1974. So I'm coming up on 50 years since I started this journey. In all those 50 years and all the preaching that I've done, I never preached on just Genesis chapter 42. And so when I looked at it, I thought, what is going on here? And so this is what I compare it to. I compare it to my being invited to be a part of a pig roast. This is South Carolina, and pig roasts are a big thing, and we're all into that, although I'm not sure you know what real barbecue is. But anyway, for those of us from the Southwest. And so anyway, I'm thinking, okay, so James and Pastor Randy, they're taking the best part of the pig, and they're preparing that and serving that. If you've been a part of this journey here or at the main campus, beginning in chapter 37 of Genesis, we're introduced to Joseph. And it's a great story. This whole account is one of the great stories in all of Scripture. Principles, truths in that. So you have him being sold by his brothers into slavery. You have that whole issue. You have him ending up in Potiphar's house and avoiding temptation and being thrown in prison. And then finally being elevated out of prison through the providence of God in some bad dreams some people are having, which was last week. And so he's elevated, and he's made the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. The only person with more power is Pharaoh himself. Now that's a great story. To be lifted from, that to have been abandoned and sold by your family and to end up in the worst place, and then for God to raise you up and put you in a great place. And if you go to the end of the story, you have one of those great passages about the sovereignty of God when the story unfolds, and we talk about what other people intend for evil, God intends for good. To bring about good things out of bad things. So you have that at the beginning, a great story, and at the end you have a great story, and in the middle you have chapter 42 that's not a great story. And I'm thinking, they're serving up the ham, and they're serving up the pork chops, and they're serving up the ribs and the sausage and the pork loin, and so what had they left me on this Sunday in chapter 42? But they left me the pig guts. And I'm going, well, what do you do with pig guts? Well, I'll show you what I know about pig guts. Here, put this first picture up here. This is an image from a couple of years ago. This is a boar. Go ahead and put the next picture up here. See him in all of his glory. I know he looked like a bear there, but 484 pounds that took down in Walterboro a couple of years ago. Did not shoot him, stabbed him, took him out. And so this is what I know about pigs. What's that? I love that reaction. So it's like, what do you do with pig guts? And in the back of my mind, it's one of those kind of weird things when you're in this season of life when ideas just crop in your head and you don't know where they come from. The word chitlins came to my mind. And I'm thinking, well, what are chitlins? And so I go and look it up, and you know what chitlins are? Chitlins are pig intestines that have been prepped for eating. Anybody here had any chitlins would admit to it? Did you know what it was before you ate it? No, you see. I'm not going to ask you if you ate it again after that fact. And so I read about it, and you know that a pig has 140 feet of intestines. And I'm thinking, that's a lot of chitlins. So if you're given intestines to serve, you make really good chitlins out of that. So that's what this passage was to me. It's like, so we're going to do the best we can with what we have, which brings us to a little of English history. Go ahead and put the next image up there. So as I read this passage, and I'm refining it through 50 years of ministry and preaching, and the fact that I've never covered this passage before, and I'm looking for what are the truths here. Because all Scripture is given by inspiration of God, right? Even the begets and the begots and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and that's all by the inspiration of God. There's a word in it for us, so what is the word in this passage? And it occurred to me, which is one of my favorite expressions of the spiritual journey, it just occurred to me as I'm reading this, that in the first part of the story, we have Joseph going to prison and Joseph getting out of prison. And then I come to this story and I'm reading this account, and it occurred to me that you have a series of conversations with people that are in their own form of prison. And I thought about that. I'm not a poet guy. English literature was not my thing. Matter of fact, English grammar was not my thing until I studied Greek, and then I knew I didn't know anything. But I came across a guy in English history. There was what was known as the English Civil Wars. You may know this. And that is when there was a war, it was a power struggle. You know, if we think American politics are ugly, you ain't seen anything. You know, American politics now pales compared to American politics during the Civil War. Nasty, nasty. Or at the Revolutionary War. Nasty, nasty. English history. So you have Charles I, who believes in the authority of God's authority on him. He stacks the parliament with a bunch of bishops who support his cause. And then you have the parliamentarians. So you have the royalists and the parliamentarians. And they're going back and forth about who's in charge. And then you have Richard Lovelace, this guy right here, who was a Cavalier poet, and which means he was a soldier, but he liked writing poetry. And there was a bill that Parliament wanted to act on, and he took and burned it. So they didn't even have a copy. Well, it landed him in jail. You know, somebody said that the next president will put us back in jail. Well, in this case, they did put him in jail. And while he was in jail, he wrote a poem that you probably don't know the name of. You probably don't know that he was the one that wrote it, but the words will be familiar. It's called To Althea from Prison. Put the words up there. Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Does that ring a bell to any of you? Man, I feel great. For somehow that came to my mind. And when I read that, I thought, well, what does he mean by that? He mean a couple of things, but we know his story was that he had a love interest outside. And he said, you can lock me up, but love, the love that I have for Althea and the love that she has for me sets me free. Stone walls do not a prison make for me, or iron bars a gate. And I thought, that's great. That's great. You can be free if you're a prisoner of love. But I thought, well, in this context, pig guts, Genesis 42, I think it means something else. It means a person can be imprisoned without being behind stone walls and iron bars. And some of you know what I'm talking about. It's when you aren't free to do and to be that what God has promised you to be and to do. All right, so let's look at today's text, our passage. We're entitling this, put up our title slide there. Y'all will appreciate this. Prisons of our making. The two of our favorite characters here, Barney and Otis, and behind bars. Prisons of our making, because I realize in reading this passage and in so much of Scripture, because the history of humanity is just messy. And so the history in Scripture is messy too. And so you have messy stories with messy people. And in this context, and all these prisons that aren't about bars and walls are prisons that the characters have made for themselves, that they can blame nobody else for. So let's read our text today out of Genesis chapter 42. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt. And Jacob said to his sons, why are you staring at one another? He said, behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place, so that we may live and not die. Then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, I am afraid that harm may befall him. So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. The first prison of our making is the prison of fear. I'm so glad that Jacob actually gives us those words, Because in this scenario, we saw the story last week if you were there, that while Joseph was in prison with a couple other prisoners, they had dreams, he interpreted those dreams, and finally his power of interpretation that he didn't own, he gave God credit for, got him to the place where he interpreted a couple of dreams of Pharaoh. Dreams about cows, skinny cows, ugly cows, fat cows. And so Joseph was brought out to interpret these. He said interpretations belong to God. And he interpreted Pharaoh. He said, you've had a prophetic dream about the years to come. You're going to have the 7 fat cows. Those are 7 really good years. Bumper crops, everything's going to go great. The 7 ugly cows that come along and eat up the fat cows, those are 7 lean years when there's going to be famine in the land. And I would recommend to you that during the 7 good years, you need to lay in store so you've got food during the 7 famine years. And Pharaoh's so impressed by the whole scene, he said, nobody else is as smart as you. I'm going to put you in charge of that project. So he goes from the dungeon to the second most powerful person in Egypt. And so the famine is spread. And we pick up in chapter 42 where the scene shifts from Egypt back up to Canaan. And here is Joseph's family, his dad and his other brothers. And the famine is spread there, so the crops don't grow, and those that do grow, the insects eat, and everything is dying, and so they're starving to death. And Jacob hears or sees that there's food in Egypt. So he says to his sons, why don't you go down and bring us back some food so we don't starve to death? But he only sent 10 of them because he was in a prison of fear about his youngest son. Now, you know his youngest son was actually the real blood brother of Joseph. Shared the same father and the same mother. And so Jacob is in a prison of fear, not willing to send everybody to get the help that is needed. We understand the prison of fear because the prison of fear is that which keeps us from doing that which we would do otherwise, out of fear. Now, can any of you relate to the prison of fear that we all experienced here as a nation called COVID? When, 3 years ago? We were subjected to the fact that this pandemic was upon us. It was going to be as bad as the 1918 pandemic. It was going to kill us all. And so let's do all these draconian measures to protect ourselves. You remember what those were? Shut down the churches for a little while, and some churches shut down for a couple of months. And one of the reasons my wife and I ended up at Summerville Baptist is because after 2 months, Summerville Baptist resumed service, in-person worship that didn't have mask mandates. I'm the not masked person, just so you know. And I'd actually read, because we first caught wind of the pandemic at the end of 2020 in December. And so I began doing my research. I realized that in the Asian countries, they'd been dealing with SARS for years. And if you went to Japan, people were masked to protect against SARS. So I thought, there's got to be research out there about the efficacy of masks. And so I read up on this research from Japan, and you know what I read? They don't work. But what happened? We were given mask mandates. And people began to live in fear of contracting this. And then we went to that social distancing. And this is what I love, because I preach in a lot of small churches. It's the place that they let an old guy come and preach. And so I go to all these small churches, and when the pandemic came, and they were worried about social distancing, they were already doing it. The 12 people in attendance, they were sitting all over the room. They weren't close to each other anyway. Nothing changed for them. But there was this spirit of fear that was impressed upon us. And once it's all said and done and the research has come out, what we learned was it was not based on science at all. But we were subjected to being imprisoned by fear, people afraid to go because of what was not true. Or fear when it comes to faith. I mean, this is really a tough one. In 1972, James, this was actually history back then. This is when Richard Nixon was reelected to the White House, and that was one of our presidents, in case you didn't know. I took a job as. Did we show the 2 pictures of me? Did we already do that? Did we skip over those? Go back and find those. I've got to show these. Because this is my I love that reaction. This is 1972, all right? This is that year. I graduated from high school that year. You get out of your system. This was me. I'm not going to church. I'm not going to a party. I'm not going to a special event. I am at an airport getting ready to fly to Alberta, Canada. Because back then, this is how you dressed to travel. Any of you remember that? Women wore dresses, men wore suits. I must say, since then, I've only gained 1.5 pounds a year. But I was a prisoner of expectations of culture. I was expected to conform to the dress code back then. And so I was in this prison of expectation. Then put up the next picture. This is just a little over 20 years ago. I planted a church in 1993 in Maryland, and God had set me free from the culture of expectation, even in churches. I quit wearing suits, got rid of all my suits, because I was reaching people that didn't go to church. A bunch of heathen. Seriously. God sent us a wave of recovering addicts, and, they didn't dress up. And you see, I actually had a beard back before it was fashionable. I did it when it was not fashionable. It's because I understood that prison of fear, of expectations. We want to be accepted. We want to be approved of. And so we can be imprisoned by all that context and that environment. So go back to that first point of the prison of fear. So in 1972, I went to work for a bank in data processing. I was a computer operator in 1973. Listen, these things we carry around in our pockets, this has got like 100 times more power in that room full of computers back then. And I worked with some friends that were believers, and I worked with other people that were not. And there was a guy named John. He worked in the proof department. That doesn't mean anything to you. But anyway, we became friends. And so in the evening, in the schedule, when we'd have a break, and we'd go get something to eat. And so John was let's just say he was not a believer. And he drove a 1967 Camaro, Chevrolet Camaro. And we went to dinner. And I want to share the gospel with John. And so I present the gospel to him. And he looks at me and he said, I like what I hear, but I'm afraid to say yes to Jesus because I'm afraid I might like it. And I like my life now. He was in a prison of fear that caused him to say no to Jesus Christ. So that's the first prison here. All right, next text. Go to the next passage. Pick up in verse 6. Now Joseph was a ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, "Where you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." But Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them and said to them, "You are spies, and you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land." Then they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We're all sons of one man. We're honest men. Your servants are not spies." Yet he said to them, "No, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land." But they said, "Your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive." Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you, you're spies. By this you will be tested by the life of Pharaoh. You shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you that you may get your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." So he put them together in the prison for 3 days. Now Joseph said to them on the 3rd day, "Do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison. But as for the rest of you, go, carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brothers to me, so that your words may be verified, and you will not die." And they did so. The second prison of our making that's in this passage is the prison of bitterness. The prison of bitterness. In this passage, when we read, the scene is self-explanatory. These men go into a foreign land. They go to the person that's responsible for selling the grain, and they don't recognize who he is. But he recognizes who they are. He's speaking through an interpreter. They don't have a clue. And rather than just simply sell them food and send them on the way, he does something else. And I'm persuaded that not only, the passage says here, he remembered the dream that he had that got him in trouble to start with. The dream that his brothers and his mom and dad and all the world would bow down to him. And he was not liked for that, and his brothers sold him into slavery. I don't think he just remembered the dreams he had. I think he remembered the fact that they sold him into slavery. They didn't care if he lived or if he died. Now, you've got to remember, how much time has elapsed here? In chapter 37, where this story of Joseph begins, he's 17 years old. He's a spoiled brat at 17. He's a mama's boy at 17. The rest of them are out in the field, except for his little brother Benjamin, working, and he's running back and forth. And he goes out to take back a report, and they connive and take him and throw him in a hole and dip his special coat in blood so they can lie about what happened to him, and they sell him to a traveling caravan and say, we're done with that dreamer. I'm absolutely convinced that he's remembering that too when this happens. And if you've been in that moment when you didn't anticipate the scene, but you're sitting there looking and watching, that the wheels, the gears in your brain are just spinning and spinning and spinning, and you're just like, what do I do? Because I'm convinced he's still harboring bitterness, that he's in a prison of bitterness. Because I think if it was not true, he would have reacted entirely differently. You go back into his own family history, the story of his own dad and his twin brother. You remember that story, born twins. Esau came out first, and so that made him the older brother. And Jacob was a mama's boy too, special treated by his mom. And somewhere along the way, he was named Jacob, which means what? Usurper, conniver. And that's exactly what he became. And he fooled Esau out of his birthright. And he fooled him out of his father's blessing. And Esau was so ticked off that last time, he said, I'm going to kill you. And at that point in time, Isaac and his wife thought, well, this would be a good time for Jacob to leave and go find a wife, because we don't want one of our sons killing the other one. And so they sent him off back home, because they didn't want him to marry a pagan woman. So they sent him back to marry a relative. They figured he was probably old enough, because at this stage he's 77 years old. Now that shows he was a mama's boy, because mama never wants that boy to leave home and marry. So at 77 he went, and we heard the story. He went out there, he met the lady of his dreams, and talked to her dad and said, I'll work 7 years for her. And so he said, yeah, sure it is. And he worked 7 years, and he got stuck with her sister. Remember that. Worked 7 more years to get her, and he kept staying on there until he developed an empire. Animals and kids and families, and end up with 4 wives and a whole bunch of kids, and finally decided it's time to go back home at the risk of encountering the wrath of his brother. And so when he gets back, he's approaching the land where the family was. He broke everybody up into small groups. He's got 2 real wives and 2 concubine wives, and so he breaks everybody up with their kids and a bunch of animals. And he sends them in waves so that when they encounter Esau, they can say to him, Jacob says, these are his gifts to you. These are his gifts to you. These are his gifts to you. But you read the story, what happens was that Esau encounters all these things, and he finally, of course, Jacob's at the rear. He's a real man of courage. He's at the rear. And when he finally comes to Esau, he's pleading for mercy. And Esau, forget about it. It's gone. It's under the water under the bridge. I've forgotten all about that. God has blessed me. I hold no ill will to you. And he embraced him. You see, if Joseph wasn't in the prison of bitterness, when he saw his brothers, he would have broken and celebrated that reunion. Now, he'll get to figure out how that works out in the end of the story. You'll have to come back for that. But the prison of bitterness, it's one of the things in Scripture that we're warned against because it can start as a seed. And the thing is, it doesn't have to be anything that's real. We can just assume that we've been wronged and we can get a seed of bitterness planted. And when it starts growing, it's wicked. It's like wisteria. Y'all know what that's like. It will take that and sweet gums will take over the world. So the prison of our making of bitterness. Number 3, the third passage. Then they said to one another, truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us. Reuben answered them, saying, did I not tell you? Do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen. Now comes the reckoning for our blood. They did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. He turned away from them and wept, but when he returned to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money in his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey, and thus it was done for them. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed from there. As one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of his sack. Then he said to his brother, my money has been returned, and behold, it is even my sack. And their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? Man, this third one is maybe the deepest, darkest out of all the prisons we make for ourselves. It's the prison of guilt. The prison of, you've got to contextualize this in a timeline. We're talking about he was 17 when he was sold into slavery. He was 30 when he was delivered from the dungeon to made the second most important person in the land. They've already passed 7 years of plenty, and now they're in the 7 years, the 7 lean years. So Joseph is close to 40 years old. It's been over 20 years since his brothers did this. They've gone on with their lives. They've all got married. They've had kids. They've been doing all those kind of things. And they go down to Egypt, and he's playing cat and mouse with them through this whole thing. It's like, how can I mess with them? And he's doing a good job of it. And when they make their way back, and they stop and they find their money in their bags, they're beside themselves. But what do they think about? They think about their own guilt. God is paying us back for what we did to our brother over 20 years ago. The prison of guilt. People, some of you maybe can relate to this. Some of us were blessed to have been raised in Christian homes, godly parents. They didn't just talk it, they lived it. And we got to witness it, and we were raised in that environment. Most people don't live that kind of life. Most people grow up, and if you're part of my generation, I'm one of those that lived through the 70s and actually remembers it. Most of them say they can't for good reason. People live for themselves before they ever hear the gospel, and they come to that point, and one of the questions they have is, can God possibly forgive me? Because I am so guilty of the worst sin. One of the addicts I did ministry with, still do ministry with, in like 2002 or something, his wife left him, and I got to share the gospel with him, and he prayed the sinner's prayer. And I'm thinking, finally. But I stepped back because I'm always leery to assume that that's a silver bullet coming to faith. Matter of fact, some of you probably prayed the sinner prayer more than once. And it didn't change anything until something changed in here. And so I waited and watched, and nothing happened. And that guy finally, retired and moved to Florida. And we stayed in touch. I'm one of the people he reached out to and carry on these conversations. And so I guess it was 3 years ago, 2 years ago, I thought, I've got to follow up. I've just, time is wasting and we're not getting any younger. And so I took a trip to Florida, got on my motorcycle and went to Florida. sat down with him, says, I got to know. When you prayed that prayer, what were you thinking? I mean, were you serious about that? It's like, and I thought he was just going to say, get out of here, leave me alone. But he didn't. He was very kind and congenial. And so we continued this dialogue. I said, you need to follow up. And so we had those conversations. I said, this is what we're going to talk about from this point forward. And so anyway, I left him and came back and thought, well, maybe there's still hope. And we had a mutual friend in all the recovering addicts we knew, a guy by the name of Mason. And Mason was somebody that I knew his name. We'd spoken by phone scores of times, but I'd never met him. He lived on the eastern shore of Maryland, and he was the resource person. If you need to know about a recovery place or a treatment center or a meeting, that kind of stuff, you call Mason. He knew everything, knew everybody. And so I saw on Facebook that he had become a part of a church and he was being baptized. And I thought, wow, I wonder what happened in Mason's life. And so I called him. Mason, I said, I got to know. I said, when did you go from being clean to being forgiven? He said, 12 years ago. I went, 12 years? I said, what took you so long to go from that to making a commitment into a local church and publicly being a part of being baptized? And he said, when I went into a church, he said, I looked at all those other people and I thought to myself, none of them have done what I've done or been where I've been. I am guilty and I feel self-conscious about being here. And he was in a prison of guilt until finally, I don't know what triggered him, but he finally moved forward in following Jesus Christ. That prison of guilt, I've seen it hold so many people back because you can't conceive. There's no bad that any person could ever have done that they can't be forgiven for and set free. And it goes from being an element of shame in their lives to a marker of God's grace. All right, the last passage. When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies of the country. But we said to him, we are honest men. We are not spies. Were they deluded or what? They're honest men, yeah. We're 12 brothers, son of our father. One is no longer alive, and the youngest is with our father today in the land of Canaan. The man, the Lord of the land, said to us, by this I will know that you're honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me and take grain for the famine of your household and go. But bring your youngest brother to me that I may know that you're not spies, but honest men. I will give your brother to you, and you may trade in this land. Now it came about as they were emptying their sacks that, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were dismayed. Their father Jacob said to them, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin. All these things are against me. And then Reuben. Talk about the dumb things that we say when we're in prison. This is one of the dumbest ones. Look at this. Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, you may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you. But Jacob said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm shall befall him on the journey you're taking, then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. The last prison of our making is the prison of hopelessness. This is the text I've been given. There's no celebration in this whole passage of victory. It's a series of self-imposed imprisonments down to this final one. There's no hope, and they're all now in a prison of hopelessness. You been there? So while, go ahead, give us the next picture here. While Richard Lovelace was in and out of jail because of the side of politics he found himself on when he hadn't lived out his life, At that same season in English history, you had the struggle not just between the parliamentarians and the royalists, but you had the struggle between the Church of England and the Puritans, the nonconformists, and all these people. And they were nasty toward each other. They passed a law, the Religious Act of 1592, and this is what was embodied. The act imprisoned without bail those over the age of 16 who failed to attend church, persuaded others to do the same, denied Queen Elizabeth I's authority in religious matters, and who attended unlawful religious meetings. John Bunyan, not to be confused with Paul Bunyan. Paul had the big ox. John was a preacher. He was a Puritan. He was a nonconformist in England, and he broke that law. And for that, he was sentenced to 12 and a half years in prison. He'd been married. He had 4 children. His oldest daughter was born blind. His wife had died. He remarried, and shortly after that is when he was locked up. And he told them he would not recant his position of faith. And while he was in prison, he was not imprisoned, because he began to write prolifically about his spiritual journey, produced a lot of works while he was in prison. Sort of like Paul. You know, what the great thing about Paul, who was locked up, he was imprisoned, but he was free. He wrote 4 things we call epistles. They were called prison epistles because they're documents that even today are liberating documents 2,000 years after the fact. That Bunyan's greatest work is known as, put this up here, The Pilgrim's Progress, which is an allegory of the Christian life. If you've never read it, I encourage you to do so. In there, he likens all these characters to experiences in the spiritual journey. He talks about the man who has a burden. He sees a wicker gate. He's laid down with his burden. And until that's relieved from him, he's under this burden of sin. And then once he's relieved from that, he's making his way to the celestial city. And this account allegorically is about that whole journey. Well, on that journey, he keeps encountering these people that have interesting names that you can relate to. And the going gets a little rough in there. And they look across the way, and there's a meadow over there that doesn't have weeds and thorns and all that kind of stuff. And so he and his friend cross over the stile, and they're making it easy going to the celestial city. And they get toward evening, and the path veers away from where they want to go, and they decide, we're going the wrong direction. We need to turn around and go back and cross back over to where it's hard going. But it became night on them before they could get back. They found a place to lay down and sleep, and they woke up in the morning under the control of giant despair, who took them and locked them up in Doubting Castle. And in that castle, they were left in the dungeon by giant despair, who would come into them and torment them during the day about their faith and say, the only way you're getting out of here is if you kill yourself. Day after day after day, that's what they were subjected to. But listen to what Christian finally says one day. He says, now a little before it was day, good Christian, as one half amazed, break out in this passionate speech. What a fool, quoth he, am I, thus to lie in a stinking dungeon, when I may as well walk at liberty. I have a key in my bosom called promise, that will, I am persuaded, open any lock in Doubting Castle. And his friend said, well, for goodness sake, get the key. And said he reaches in and he pulls out the key of promise, and they go to the door and put it in there, and it unlocks the door. And they go to the next gate and they put it in there and they unlock the gate, and they go to the next one until they finally get completely out of the castle. And they go back to the place where they crossed the stile, and they cross the stile and put a big sign up there that says, don't go this way. You'll end up where you don't want to be. What is the key of promise that can unlock the gate of any self-made prison? We find this in put up the next passage there. This is out of Hebrews. Now, we go back to Hebrews because it takes us back before Jacob. It takes us back before Joseph. It takes us back to Abraham. The writer of Hebrews says, for when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and will surely multiply you. And so having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath given as confirmation is an end of every dispute. In the same way, God desiring even more to show to his heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have is an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. That the key of promise, even for the people in Joseph's day, before Jesus came along, was the promise of faith, to put your faith in God, because God does not lie. And God says, trust me, and I will bless you and meet your needs and prosper you. And then when Jesus came along, look at this. He stood up in the synagogue that day to inaugurate his public ministry. And this is the text he read out of Isaiah 61. He said, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim what? Liberty to the captives and freedom to the prisoners. Jesus Christ came so we don't have to be stuck in any stinking prison, even of our own making. Bow your heads and let me pray for you. I don't know what it is that you need to do in your response and your relationship to God, but the truth is he offers to us freedom, release from every form of imprisonment in our mind and our heart, that we might enjoy his liberty in Jesus Christ. So whatever you need to do today in response to this time, as I pray for you, you take care of that business in your heart. Father, thank you that we can know what it is to be free. And that in that time when we come and we bow before Jesus Christ and we admit our unworthiness, that we deserve to be locked up and have the key thrown away. But you tell us that we don't have to, that Jesus paid the price for our freedom. And if we'll just confess our need of him and surrender our heart and our will to him, that he will come in and not just forgive us, but he'll set us free. Help us now in this moment of our response. Do those things that your Spirit is inviting us to do, that we might know the fullness of your freedom. In Jesus' name we pray for his sake.